Now, what I want to talk about or speculate on in this video is what George Lucas would have done with the sequel trilogy based off the little bits of information we've got out of him thus far, which honestly hasn't been much. And no, this video isn't going to be an essay about how Lucas would have made a better trilogy than what we're currently getting out of Disney, because in all honesty and fairness, there's simply no way to ever know that. I mean, even if Lucas came out and gave us a full-blown story treatment or script, which would be cool mind you, but would probably irk the hell out of Disney, it'd still be impossible to know just how it would have translated to the big screen and how it would compare to what we're getting now. Anyway, as for what we actually know about what Lucas would have done with the sequel trilogy, well, again, there's not much to go on other than a few tidbits taken from here and there. First, we have what I believe J.J. Abrams said, though feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about who actually did say this. But Lucas's story would have included the original cast, but focused more on a group of teenagers. And I can only guess those teenagers would have included a Jedi or two trained under Luke, and I'd further guess that at least one of them would have been a child of Han and Leia, and possibly a child of Luke as well. Next, we have what Luke Skywalker himself, or should I say Mark Hamill, has said about Lucas's version of the sequels, and that is that Luke wouldn't have been killed off until the end of Episode 9, and that he would have followed the advice of Master Yoda and passed on what he had learned by training Leia in the ways of the Force. And though I can nod my head to that and say I like where that sounds like where it's going, it doesn't really offer us much in the way of what the story itself would have been about. However, that recently changed somewhat when Lucas apparently revealed some details about his plans for the sequel trilogy to none other than fellow acclaimed director James Cameron for a book that is meant to be a companion piece for an AMC series called James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. Anyway, the quotes from Lucas himself that follow are taken somewhat out of context, but I believe the gist can be understood nonetheless. The next 3 Star Wars films we're going to get into the microbiotic world, but there's this world of creatures that operate different than we do. I call them the whills, and the whills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force. Back in the day, I used to say ultimately what this means is we were just cars, vehicles for the whills to travel around in. We're vessels for them. And the conduit is the midi-chlorians. The midi-chlorians are the ones that communicate with the whills. The whills, in a general sense, they are the Force. All the way back to with the Force and the Jedi and everything, the whole concept of how things happen was laid out completely from the beginning to the end. But I never got to finish. I never got to tell people about it. If I held onto the company, I could have done it, and then it would have been done. Of course, a lot of fans would have hated it, just like they did the Phantom Menace and everything. But at least the whole story from beginning to end would be told. Okay, now your reaction to hearing that may be anything from thank God Lucas didn't get a chance to make the sequel trilogy, to pure intrigue about just what all this means or could have meant for Star Wars. Me personally, I tend to lean towards the latter. My curiosity about what Lucas had in mind is very much piqued, and here, a bit long-winded, but please bear with me, is why. Star Wars, in the eyes of George Lucas, was never meant to become what it is today, meaning to him, it's nothing more than a story, one he certainly loves a great deal, sure, but it's still just a story. To a lot of us fans, however, Star Wars is far, far more than just a story. It's a passion and an obsession that we always want more of. Now, in my last video I talked about the expanded universe, but what I didn't mention is that Lucas himself was never a fan of it. He never considered it a part of his Star Wars. Yes, from time to time he took ideas from it, but he didn't care about blatantly disregarding it when and where he wanted, in both the prequels and the Clone Wars animated series. And I've had several debates with people about why Lucas allowed it to exist in the first place if he didn't care about it or he didn't consider it his Star Wars. Now, some think it was just easy money for him, but I truly think, and this is the same reason why I think he sold Lucasfilm to Disney, that he cares a great deal about the fans and wanted them to have more Star Wars, and to have it in a way he could never give it to them. Because what these comments here again reiterate to me is that Lucas sees Star Wars as just one story. He doesn't care about some of the nitty-gritty details like some or most fans do. He only cares about what works for his story. This is why I believe inconsistencies exist between the prequels and original trilogy, because absolute continuity isn't as important to him as it is to us fans. Again, telling the story is what it's all about for him, and without question, there are incredible stories in that man's head, and if he'd only been a bit better getting them out, perhaps the prequel trilogies would have been more beloved overall, and he would have done the sequels, because I truly believe all the hate he got for the prequels is the reason why, for the longest time, Lucas insisted there was no story to be told after Episode 6, a stance he only started to back away from in the years leading up to the sale of Lucasfilm to Disney. Now, what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout way is that in his sequel trilogy, Lucas would have finished the story of Star Wars, and for me, that's both somehow an exciting and terrifying prospect. And one of the reasons Disney no doubt rejected his story treatments for the sequel trilogy, seemingly outright too, is that they have no intention on finishing Star Wars. On the contrary, this seems to be just the beginning for them. Though I also have little doubt that all the talk about midi-chlorians and such also scared them away from his ideas as well. Anyway, let me now jump off the deep end and give some crazy speculation about what Lucas's sequel trilogy may have looked like based mainly off those few quotes. And do try and unlearn what you have learned about Star Wars for a moment, and keep in mind, Lucas only cares about his story, not decades of established truths and facts from the old expanded universe. So please save yourself the trouble of running off to the comments saying, I'm all wrong about this or that. This is just fun, wild speculation about what I think he may have had in mind, though I could be 100% off here. First, I think it's very intriguing that Lucas both says the whills feed off the Force and that they also are the Force in a general sense, because these feel rather contradictory. Why would something feed off itself? This also seems to fly in the face of the symbiotic relationship which, like it or not, was one of the themes brought up to the forefront in The Phantom Menace and has always been underlying throughout Star Wars. This implies to me that the whills are nothing like I've always thought them to be, that being almost godlike beings that may have even created the Star Wars universe and proceeded to record the history of it in the Journal of the Whills, which if you don't know, the story of Star Wars is taken from the Journal of the Whills. Anyway, Lucas using the word feeding off the Force almost implies the whills are something more like a parasite, or the opposite of a symbiotic relationship. Further backing this up is the fact that Lucas basically says the whills are using the beings of the Star Wars galaxies like vehicles or cars, and that they communicate with them through the midi-chlorians. And since we learned in Episode 1 that midi-chlorians speak the will of the Force to those able to hear it, it means that the will of the Force is actually the will of the, whills, and that a true Jedi actually seeks to carry out the will of the whills in an effort to balance the Force. In other words here, this seems to render the Jedi down to tools of the whills to keep a balance within the Force. The question then becomes why? Well, the simple answer seems to be, if the whills feed off the Force, and they want it to be balanced, it means a balanced Force makes for an optimal food source, I guess you could say, to keep it simple. So if at the end of Return of the Jedi the Force was brought into some sort of final balance, as the prophecy seems to imply it would be, and as Lucas himself has said it was, then that means the whills post-Return of the Jedi now have an optimal food source to feed off of, and presumably for the first time in eons when you consider the Sith and who knows what else before in George's version of Star Wars, have been around for a very, very long time. My best guess then, and this is where we start to get really crazy, as if it hasn't been crazy enough, is that Luke Skywalker will discover the truth of the Jedi, that they are little more than tools of the whills to keep the Force balanced so that they can feed. The problem, of course, is that the Force is life, and life is the Force. So if you feed off it, you're feeding off life, which again ties into the presumption that the whills are parasites. And eventually, parasites have a nasty tendency to kill their host, which in this case would mean the end of the Force and life in the Star Wars galaxy. I would then further guess that it wasn't the midi-chlorians that brought about the Chosen One or Anakin Skywalker, but no doubt the whills themselves that created him, which means to combat Luke Skywalker and his Jedi, who would no doubt be seeking a way to end the whills' hold over the Force, or to remove them from it somehow, the whills will bring about a new champion, if you will, to destroy Skywalker and the Jedi, something even more powerful than the Chosen One, and hence you have your villain for the sequel trilogy. As for how it plays out from there, that's anyone's guess, but I'd imagine Luke gives his life at the end of Episode 9 to free the Force from the whills in some respect, and what the Journal of the Whills actually is an accounting of how they were defeated. Now, if you want to take to the comments and tell me that's the craziest thing you've ever heard, and it would have ruined Star Wars forever, I'll completely understand that, because I myself don't know how I feel about this theory. And as I said before, I could be way off on what Lucas had planned for the sequel trilogy, or I could be somewhere in the general vicinity, who knows. For better or worse though, we'll likely never know what he had planned for the sequel trilogy. But one thing I do feel pretty certain about is that Lucas would have indeed furthered and finished the story of Star Wars in the sequel trilogy. Two things I'm not sure will be said of Disney's sequel trilogy when it's all said and done. In fact, if anything, this new sequel trilogy feels more like a soft reboot right now. And what I really liked about this idea that Lucas may have been going for is it gives a threat to the Force itself, which feels like the next evolution of the story to me. And it's something that hopefully one day we'll get out of a story from Disney. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Does this sound like something Lucas would do with his sequel trilogy, or am I way off? And if this is anything like he had planned, how do you think it would have gone over with the fans? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.